If it's Friday for the first time since the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, the annual anti-abortion March for Life is taking place today, trying to ramp up pressure on Republican lawmakers to push for a federal abortion ban. Plus, President Biden finally speaks out about the special counsel investigation into classified documents, insisting the whole issue has been overblown and that he has no regrets, despite the backlash. And dozens of Ukraine's closest allies huddle in Germany as NATO leaders debate escalation and U.S. officials designate Russian mercenary group, the Wagner Group, a transnational criminal organization. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Chuck Todd here in Washington, where thousands of pro-life activists rallied on the National Mall today in the first March for Life since the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade last June. Sunday will mark the 50th anniversary of that landmark decision, which is now no longer the law of the land. For decades, the pro-life movement marched in Washington on the anniversary of the decision, urging the Supreme Court to overturn Roe. Well, they got what they wanted. So what did activists do this time? Now they're focusing their energy on Congress. They want a federal ban, which many Republicans worry would be an electoral disaster for the party, especially considering the midterm backlash on the abortion issue. The march's route this year, which has gone to the Supreme Court for decades, today wrapped around the Capitol, an obvious, not so subtle message to the Republican congressional majority in the House. But party leaders seem keenly aware of the political risks here, because despite their close association with the anti-abortion rights movement, House Republicans haven't put a bill on the floor that would further restrict abortion. Instead, they've held votes on two largely symbolic messaging bills. In fact, the highest-ranking person to show up to the rally today, Steve Scalise, who's number 2 in the House, he actually touted the messaging bills today and gave no hint at calling for a federal ban on abortion.
For those of you that are about to become 18 or just turned 18, you've got to register, you've got to vote, you've got to go support pro-life candidates because it matters. It matters. Life and death is at stake in this march for life.
What Republicans now face is a potential disconnect between the aims of this pro-life movement and the political realities facing Republicans after this last election. In our nationwide exit poll, the polling's not even that close. A majority of midterm voters said abortion should be legal in all or most cases. Only 36% said it should be illegal in all or most cases. This is not a 50-50 issue. And when abortion was clearly on the ballot in 6 statewide referendums, the abortion access side won in every single race. And we're not talking about blue states. Kansas, Kentucky being the big outliers there, if you will, if you want to just look at it through the red-blue prism. Just yesterday, South Carolina Republican Congresswoman Nancy Mace said that GOP needs to learn a lesson after their lackluster performance in the midterms. Take a listen.
We didn't learn anything from the midterm election cycle. We didn't learn anything after overturning of Roe v. Wade. We buried our head in the sand, and we did as we always did, which was pay service to the life movement. The vast majority of the people that I represent on either side of the aisle were not happy after Roe v. Wade was overturned. And I'm a pro-life member of Congress. I have many exceptions, but I'm willing to meet in the middle and find some common ground.
And while national Republicans may want to duck the issue's thorny politics for now, circumstances are going to make this impossible. 23 states have already seen legislation to restrict abortion further in 2023, including some bills that seek to totally outlaw the procedure in a state or even charge abortion providers with homicide. 2023 will also see state house elections in places like Virginia, where Republicans just lost a special state Senate election in a swing area that was Republican held, just as Republican Governor Glenn Youngkin was pushing a 15-week ban. Not to mention the 2024 presidential primary, where the issue promises to divide the Republican field, because you have potential candidates like Mike Pence, who are very vocal and very much consider themselves a leader in the life movement and want a federal ban. And you have people like Donald Trump, who, of course, don't want one. So after celebrations on the right last summer in the wake of the Dobbs decision, the GOP now does not have a unifying position on one of the single most important issues, particularly for voters across the country. Ali Vitale is on Capitol Hill. Also with us is Caroline Kitchener, who covers abortion politics for the Washington Post. So, Allie, in some cases, I think some of us wondered whether there would be a March for Life in Washington, D.C. today, whether it would be more focused on the 50 state capitals. But what have we learned from today's protests?
Well, look, it's clear that when they're here in Washington, they are focused on Washington. But I have to say, what I was talking about with another anti-abortion advocate earlier in the week, ahead of this 50th anniversary of the Roe versus Wade decision, is the fact that most anti-abortion advocates say that it's in the words of this one person, a theoretical debate from a congressional standpoint, because even though Republicans hold the House majority, and even though Steve Scalise can go to these rallies and tout these messaging bills, they are not going to pass the Senate, obviously, and certainly the White House is not going to help sign them into law. And so it is a dead-end road from a legislating perspective. Right. That doesn't mean that Republicans aren't going to keep messaging on it. But what I was struck by is how they are, again, on the anti-abortion side of this, looking back to the states. Caroline covers this all the time, the way that they're trying to make inroads in places where state legislatures are Republican-controlled. That's frankly how advocates against abortion were able to make these moves to eventually topple Roe with the Dobbs decision. And it's how they're going to try to move forward on issues like contraception, the abortion pill, and others.
None of this seems to be taking public opinion into account.
No.
And we saw that at the ballot box. But let me ask you this. Are Republican leaders actively trying to discourage bills being put on the floor or amendments being put on the floor that would either ban abortion or take it down to 15 weeks, 12 weeks, heartbeat bill, things like that?
We're going to see, because at the end of the year, before the midterm elections, that's when Lindsey Graham was talking about this 15-week national abortion ban. Kevin McCarthy, before he was speaker, but when he was thinking he would have the majority, said that he didn't think that that was a bad idea. There are certainly some members of his conference who would like to see that come up for a vote. They think it could be problematic for Democrats, despite the fact that this is an issue that actually worked quite well for Democrats in the midterms because of the public opinion polling that you're showing. I do think on the other side of this, though, as much as people like Nancy Mace and others have said that the party needs to learn a lesson from the 2022 midterms on repro, it's clear that they're not. And even still, Mace voted for those two messaging bills that she was speaking out against in the first place. So it does still show that the incentive structure on the right on this is to still continue to vote the party line on everything regarding reproductive access, despite the fact that the party is very much out of step with where most of Americans are on this.
Two most powerful issues in a Republican primary, guns and abortion. Yeah. They still are, so you're going to get a lot of Republicans having to do what Nancy Mace had to do there. Allie Vitale getting us started in Capitol Hill. Allie, thank you. Let me bring in Caroline Kitchener, who covers abortion politics for the Washington Post. I was very curious to see what this march was going to look like. Is it a celebration? They won, right? This was always about the Supreme Court. How much of it was going to be focused on Congress? Who was going to show up? How many potential presidential candidates? So you tell me, what have you seen? What did you assess? What have you learned from today's march?
I went out at 9 today and I just got back in, and I was really expecting this march to just be just an excitement fest. I just thought, everybody is just going to be absolutely over the moon. And what was interesting is person after person that I talked to actually was expressing some disappointment. They were frustrated that they really felt like people were not on their side on this. There was a sense that, once Roe is overturned, that's going to sort of impact the culture and get people to see abortion in a different way. And I think at least 3 people said this to me. They said, we need to win the hearts and minds of people. And they think there is a real sense among, I don't know how much anti-abortion leaders would say this, but among kind of the rank and file people who believe this in their bones, they're really sad that people just don't seem to be with them, and they recognize it and they know that it's a problem.
I want to get to the hearts and minds, because I've always felt as if the life movement was more about a legal strategy than a persuasion strategy. And their legal strategy worked. Their electoral sort of gamesmanship strategy worked, but they never focused on a persuasion strategy, it seems, or at least that was never the focus. That seems to be what's holding them back.
Well, I think the problem for them now is that they're realizing that the laws don't actually end abortion, right? And especially now that we have abortion pills that are flooding into states with bans, the laws can't stop that. And so what I'm hearing more and more from the leaders is, look, this actually is not going to stop until we really get people on board with this. And, everybody has kind of a different idea of how that's going to happen. But, I do think is going to be the next phase of this is, you're going to see anti-abortion leaders really focusing on, okay, how do we change the culture, especially the culture around abortion pills? There's a real movement to paint them as dangerous, extremely risky, which of course is not true. Right. But that's a lot of the rhetoric that we're hearing.
Is there anybody wanting to actually go the opposite direction and sort of say, hey, look, the whole goal is to end abortion and so embrace birth control? And yes, abortion pills within the first 6 weeks or something like that. Is there any sort of attempt in the life? Is anybody trying to find that ground? I remember, boy, I'm old enough to remember when Bobby Jindal, after another election where he said, hey, the Republican Party ought to be for over-the-counter birth control, thinking like, hey, let's try to disassociate the sex part of it from abortion politics.
That is such a good point, and it's really not a point that I hear made very often at all on the anti-abortion side. Nobody really wants to address that because they want to sort of they want to find some middle ground there. That none of these big mainstream anti-abortion groups want to come out and say that they're for birth control. You just don't hear it, and why you don't hear it is a really good question.
Well, I mean, I hate to be a cynic here, but an activist group, if you moderate, you probably disappoint your funders who are not so moderate.
Yeah, I think that's probably true.
What is your sense of how this march went in the state capitals? I know, obviously, you couldn't be in all 50 state capitals, but did it have the same sense, that same sense of urgency that I think this one did here?
I think we'll have to see what the numbers are. I haven't seen too much about that yet, but I have to say here in DC, I was expecting the march to be smaller, and it really wasn't. I was out there last year as well, and I would say it was just as many, if not more people. I was a little skeptical because what you hear so much from the anti-abortion movement is this is just the beginning. Right after Roe was overturned, you heard them say, this is just the beginning. I was really curious to know, is that just kind of messaging speak from the anti-abortion movement? Is that really translating to people? Are you going to feel that energy from the pro-life crowd? And I think the answer today, at least in Washington, D.C., was overwhelmingly yes. They really, they're believing that message that this is just the start.
Caroline Kitchener, who covers abortion politics for the Washington Post. Caroline, thanks very much. Appreciate you sharing your reporting with us. Well, Steve Scalise was the only member of House leadership to speak at the March for Life. He wasn't the only member of Congress on hand. New Jersey Republican Chris Smith, who's one of the leaders of the pro-life caucus in Congress, urged lawmakers at each level of government to pass laws to restrict abortion. Specifically, he's in favor of a federal heartbeat bill that has 62 co-sponsors in the House. Take a listen.
Today, we celebrate. Thank you to Justice Alito for writing a brilliant decision, brilliant opinion. And what he did was to convey to lawmakers at the federal, state, and local level to regulate or prohibit abortion. We have an engraved invitation to protect life.
I'm joined now by Carol Tobias. She's president of the National Right to Life Committee. Carol, thanks for coming in.
My pleasure.
I had the chance to speak with you the day of the Dobbs decision, and you said the next battleground was obviously going to be the states. We're 7 months since then. We've had a midterm election. Do you feel as if that's still where the battle is, or considering that this march ended at Congress today, do you think it's national again?
It's going to be a long time before we're able to do anything at the national level. Obviously, because Chuck Schumer's in charge of the Senate, we've got Joe Biden in the White House. We're not going to get anything through, at least for a couple of years. And I really think it's going to take more of a national consensus before we get a major national position, pro-life position at that level. I think it is going to be more in the states. We're already seeing some legislatures looking at various pieces of legislation. And I have always expected that if and when Roe was overturned, we were going to have some states that allowed abortion and some that protected unborn children.
Right.
And I think that's kind of where we're headed.
I want to go to the persuasion issue here. You may have heard my back and forth there. I've always thought that the pro-life movement had a really smart legal strategy, had a good electoral strategy in certain places. But always what seems missing to me is that larger persuasion strategy that almost was a divorce from the politics part. Do you accept that premise, that the persuasion hasn't worked, considering where the numbers are?
I think we used legislation as an educational tool. We wanted to make people realize that abortion was the only medical procedure that doctors weren't required to use the regular informed consent provision. So we went after that. We tried to show that parents have the right to make decisions for their minor children in a lot of different areas, but not when it comes to abortion. So we were using legislation to educate the public and also to point out the absurdity of Roe v. Wade. But we certainly needed to do more, and I think we're going to be working on that a lot more in the very near future.
I look at the Roe, oddly, has become more popular after the fact than it was in the moment. And it seems, whatever it is, perhaps maybe the public they missed the certainty that Roe provided. What do you say to that?
That's maybe true. I think we still have a lot of people in the middle that aren't ready to ban all abortions and protect the unborn children. But I still believe that there is a huge segment in this country that is not comfortable with where the abortion industry is going. Abortion for any reason throughout pregnancy, unlimited abortion. That's still not a wildly popular position.
And what's always been unique about this issue is that when Roe was the law of the land, in some ways you had an easier time creating a coalition that said, hey, this is going too far. Now that the debate is about whether it should be legal at all, it seems like now now you have the harder part. Now you have the harder job. Is that fair?
It is. And I think one of our main goals needs to be just convince women, even if abortion is legal, they don't need to get the abortion, and we would certainly hope that they don't.
So are you thinking about changing sort of the different, and so I go back to universal birth control. Is that just something that not everybody can unify around? And that if, having birth control and maybe sort of very morning after pill, is that just something if you can't get consensus on that in order as hey, if you're for this, it means fewer abortions over here?
Our organization has never taken a position on contraception, and I think it is so widely available and widely used. I'm not really sure that's a credible argument. I think that abortion is something completely different, and people do look at it that way.
Do you think there's a unifying position for the right now?
The unifying position is that we want to stop abortion. There are a lot of different ideas about what we can do, how far we can go, how fast we can go, protecting the children. I want to focus on making sure that people realize that the abortion pill, which is now becoming more readily available, is not as easy and as safe as just popping an aspirin. And I think we're going to start seeing more stories of emergency room visits increasing because of the dangers of the pill. And I think we need to just educate people about abortion isn't as safe and effective as they've been told.
What would you like to see this Republican House do? You said, look, you can't get it passed because there's a Democratic president, you got a Democratic Senate. But what do you want them to do? Do you want more of these messaging bills as educational tools?
I think that would be a great way to use their resources when it comes to abortion. Get the American people to understand that our tax dollars should not be used to pay for abortions, should not be used to subsidize abortion in any way. They did a great job, I think, on the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act. We do know that there are babies who survive abortions. They should be taken care of as any other child born at that same age. I think those are great places to focus on right now.
Well, I don't want to get into the back and forth of the specifics of those instances, and I know some of them, there's unique medical circumstances around some of them. But I come back to the public opinion. It's 2-1 that people are unhappy about this overturn. It feels as if, do you think you need the public on your side before you attempt this legislation? Or do you think getting the legislation can bring the public along?
I would say both. You know, we're certainly going to be working to pass legislation to protect unborn children. I mean, for the pro-life movement, these unborn children are members of the human family that need to be protected. Just because they are small, just because they are vulnerable, does not mean that they are inconsequential.
Can you get there without personhood?
Without personhood?
Meaning, do you have to give, because at the end of the day, it seems as if one of the, I mean, when do you, a fetus does not have constitutional rights. But some people would like to see, in so-called personhood amendments, give the fetus constitutional rights from some form. Do you think that has to happen before these other bills can become enacted?
No. No, and personhood bills actually don't have any real teeth.
You don't think they do? Because there have been some attempts in the referendum level. This is not something you guys get involved in?
But if you look at the actual language and what it would do, I'm not sure that it would change anything. We need to just have laws saying protect the unborn children, but we're also, and I'm very happy that the pro-life movement is stepping forward in faster and larger amounts than we have in the past about helping women who are trying to decide if they really can get through, you know, the pregnancy. States are coming forward with more programs to help moms and newborn babies, and I think we need to step that up, and we are.
I was just going to say, does that, you think, needs to be the almost a bigger focus of the pro-life movement is how are you going to help women after they have these children?
We want to convince women that this is not the solution and that someone is going to be there to walk with her, hold her hand, help her through what might be a very difficult time in her life. And states are stepping forward, pro-life movement is coming forward, and I think we are going to see some changes in the very near future. All
right, Carol Tobias, we will be watching. Really appreciate you coming in and representing your organization here. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
You got it. Coming up, turn. 2 years into President Biden's first term, and the White House finds itself navigating perhaps its biggest challenge so far, a criminal investigation. Plus, all eyes on 2024 in the Senate battleground map. We're going to have the latest on who's in, who's out, who to watch, and who could be retiring next. You're watching Meet the President. Welcome back. President Biden is at the midpoint of his first term in office. Actually, we're just over the midpoint, about 3.5 hours over the midpoint, but he was sworn in exactly 2 years ago today, about 4.5 hours ago, in remarks before the U.S. Conference of Mayors and in a video he tweeted. He and Vice President Harris touted what he believes are the administration's accomplishments, including the creation of nearly 11 million jobs, the appointment of Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson to the court. But today's anniversary also comes amid growing political headaches for the White House, including that special counsel investigation into how classified documents ended up in Mr. Biden's D.C. office and Delaware home. The president finally addressed the investigation yesterday more directly than before. It's the first time he's commented on the situation since there was a special counsel appointed last week. Here's what he said.
We found a handful of documents were filed in the wrong place. We immediately turned them over to the archives and the Justice Department. We're fully cooperating and looking forward to getting this resolved quickly. I think you're going to find there's nothing there. I have no regrets. I'm following what the lawyers have told me they want me to do. It's exactly what we're doing. There's no there. Thank you.
Mike Memoli joins me now from outside the White House. No regrets. No there. Mike, I had a California reporter from an affiliate of ours ask me today, why did the president choose to talk about this here in California? And I said, well, I don't think he chose to do it.
That's right.
I'm guessing the White House didn't want him addressing it out there, but he did anyway.
Well, two things there, Chuck. Right before that remark that we heard from the president, he admonished the reporter who asked him about that issue at a moment when he was trying to draw attention, obviously, to the suffering of the people out in California dealing with these extreme weather events. But secondly, it was clear that he was reading a prepared, response to a question that they have been expecting, and largely the president had ignored on 8 previous occasions in the previous 6 days. And so I think, though, what this speaks to, there's 2 schools of thought thought. One, he expressed a little bit publicly some of the frustration about how his team has handled it, the fact that this is still dogging him at this point. But the argument from folks inside the White House is something like this. You know, this was a full boiling crisis. They'll acknowledge that at the beginning of the week, that they were still getting their arms around. But by the end of the week, it's maybe down to a simmer. It's still a distraction, but they think they're at the point where they can start getting back onto their messaging terms, even with a little bit of noise around it. If your conversations, Chuck, with Biden advisors are anything like my conversations with Biden advisors, it's often complete with a media lecture about how this thing that we're focused on right now and dominating the headlines is not what actual Americans care about. They care a lot more about what you led the show with today, things like abortion rights that are going to be on the ballot across the country and ultimately in the presidential election next year, too.
I guess, Mike, the only thing I don't understand is why not acknowledge, you know what, we should have been more transparent with the public at the beginning. We thought we were doing it this way. You know, it boggles the mind. I know politicians are afraid to, like, just admit when they make a mistake. And, I mean, you know, put it this way. Every single Democrat I've talked to on Capitol Hill thinks they made a mistake in how they handled the releasing the fact that this occurred.
The silver bullet to this White House, Chuck, is the idea that they are treating this in a very different way than the former president is treating that. That relates to everything from cooperation with DOJ, but also to not discussing it publicly in any way, shape, or form to get ahead of the Justice Department. That's their explanation, but of course a lot of Democrats wish they were more upfront about it, at least that they weren't surprised by it.
I'm with a phrase that I'm going to borrow from a business leader I talked to earlier this week who said, you know, we begin with the assumption of zero trust. All politicians need to begin with the assumption with the public these days. With zero trust, you have to earn it every day. Mike Memoli at the White House for us. Mike, thank you. Up next, teach your children well. It's an important week in American history. And as we mentioned, Roe v. Wade was decided 50 years ago this week. And that historic 1973 decision came down on the same day that President Lyndon Baines Johnson died. He was obviously a former president on that day. The next day, President Richard Nixon announced a ceasefire in Vietnam. That's what led Meet the Press that Sunday, in case you're wondering. And in the same week, 25 years later, came another bombshell story in American politics. News of President Clinton's affair with a young White House intern named Monica Lewinsky. Here's her attorney, William Ginsburg, on Meet the Press, January 25th, 1988, just days after the affair became public.
Monica Lewinsky, in an affidavit, said, under oath, she did not have a sexual relationship with Bill Clinton. Is that the truth?
I cannot broach the attorney-client privilege. I can tell you that she stands on that statement.
But she also told her friend Linda Tripp she did. Why didn't she go before the grand jury and just tell the truth and say which version is correct?
We are frozen in place because we are in jeopardy. As long as there is a threat of criminal prosecution, she has an absolute right under the Constitution not to incriminate herself. It's called her Fifth Amendment right.
If Monica Lewinsky agrees with Kenneth Starr to cooperate, is granted immunity, will she tell all?
Yes, we are delighted. We are dying to tell the story, but we cannot. We are frozen in place. We want to cooperate. We have indicated that we will cooperate to the extent that I will remain in Washington as long as it takes to see that the truth in every detail, wherever it may fall, comes out.
Welcome back. As we mentioned, this week is not only the 50th anniversary of the Roe v. Wade decision, it's also the 25th anniversary of President Bill Clinton's affair with White House intern Monica Lewinsky becoming public. More than any other moment, the Clinton-Lewinsky news and the firestorm that followed arguably launched this current era of politics that we already live in. The presidential denial, the partisan probe, impeachment proceedings, even the media coverage went a long way to form the battle lines of our current landscape. I want to settle in for a minute here and talk about this. I'm joined now by my panel, NBC News senior politics editor Mark Murray, Navin Nayak, president of the Center for American Progress Action Fund, and Republican strategist Sarah Fagan. She served as White House political director for former President George W. Bush. She is also an NBC News contributor. Mark, I have, on January 17th, earlier this week, I was dumbstruck at how little attention was being given to what I think is the arguably single most important fork in the road of our current, like, this political era started on January 17th, 1998. Everything changed. And we're still living it. That's what's so remarkable. And I think because we're still living it, that's why people didn't know it was so remarkable.
Chuck, I love the clip that you had about William Ginsburg, the full Ginsburg on Meet the Press 25 years ago.
Full Ginsburg he did all 5 Sunday shows in person.
Right. And I remember watching that. It was my 3rd week on the job as a young political reporter in Washington, D.C. And to talk about how things were so instructive. I mean, this was the biggest scandal that you could imagine. It involved sex, an intern, the creation of the media.
And the internet.
Right. And the internet.
This Judge report.
I do think, though, that when we look back from 25 years ago to now, is what has changed is just how fast things are. And sometimes, actually, how fast our news cycles are doesn't allow us to kind of slow down and look at the context. But I do remember every single day during that year plus, there was a bombshell story in the Washington Post or the New York Times, and there were then the analyses of all of that. It was one big story. I do wonder if something like that happened, whether that would actually, would that peter out after a couple of months? I don't know. Would it be taken by...
not if there's sex involved.
But I mean, certainly involving the president and the age of the intern, it would be a huge story today. But your point is an excellent one, because you've got to keep in mind there was no social media back then. And news is moving so much quicker in part because people have such shorter attention spans, and there's so much more content creators out there creating news and information. So I do think you're right that it would be a big story, but it may not be as big a story, sadly, today that it was 25 years ago.
I think we're a little living it here in a very smaller context, but the George Santos thing is just another. This is like the kind of world where we do have an attention span for these kinds of scandals and this kind. Like, anyone would have thought that'd be over by now, but no, here we are. A month into the first revelations, and I think he's not going away, so it's going to continue, and new revelations keep coming out. And I actually do think it was a moment where our ability to fixate on these kinds of things is actually longer than we realize.
Well, I guess the thing that, to me, that's so interesting about it is how much different aspects of things changed, right? Activism changed, the media changed, the parties changed, how we engage in campaigns changed. You know, I had to do a little education exercise, and I've been to my staff today about the origins of the organization called Move On.
Yeah,
right. I mean, the whole name came from censure and move on, right? And that organization lives today, and it's a heartbeat of progressives, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's been actually, you know, I actually wonder how many people at Move On know that.
That's the origin.
Yeah, absolutely. But it was, I mean, it's interesting because we actually haven't been able to move on. If that was sort of it was this idea of, you know, this isn't really important. Let's get on to the stuff that matters to the American people. And at some level, our politics is stuck in focusing on things that aren't actually the things the American people are focused on.
All right. Speaking of anniversaries, let's talk about Roe v. Wade and abortion. And Sarah, can the Republican Party get to a consensus by November 2024 that is a consensus that can bring the party together? Because I feel like right now they're not there.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, on the high level things, yes. You know, we're a party that supports life. We're a party that champions, you know, women who are pregnant and wants to find resources to help them. But in terms of what does this look like post-Roe, I don't think so. Because in part, you have a movement in some ways that won. I mean, part of the challenge here for the movement is that they were successful in their core mission, and the pushback was remarkably strong, and we saw it at the ballot box. And I think in many ways the movement was not prepared for this moment. And in part,
they didn't know the backlash was coming?
Because if you look at the polling numbers, which show it 2-1, you know, disappointed or upset about the overturning, I think a lot of those people think that abortion is banned entirely. Like, there wasn't a good education movement about this is actually just sending it back to the states. And in most of the states, nothing has changed.
You know, something struck me, Mark, when Christine was reporting about how the marchers she was talking to were like lamenting that, hey, we don't have the hearts and minds. And they thought that the decision was going to change it. And it made me think, you know, the same-sex marriage decision did accelerate public opinion. And it was already moving, but the decision came, and perhaps for some that were favoring it, but maybe afraid to say it publicly, it was a permission slip. I'm guessing some pro-life activists thought the same thing might happen here, and it seems like the opposite occurred, because not only before Roe was overturned, you rarely saw Roe hit 60, right, as favorable. After it's been overturned, Roe's more popular.
Because there's confusion around it.
Well, I think the big difference there is people lost something. when you take something away from the American people, people didn't love Obamacare at first. But then when the threat was to take it away, it is the most unpopular thing you can do in politics.
I had somebody say that it's the first time a court took away a right.
Roe. They were chipping away 22, 20. People's lives didn't feel that. That's gone now. There are 17 states where you cannot get an abortion. That is a huge difference for 35 million women in this country, and I think they're not going to be able to solve this.
Most of those are wrapped up in the courts right now, but yes.
Chuck, we've looked a lot about polling when it comes to abortion rights, and we've actually been looking at a lot of generational divides. When I actually look at how millennials and Gen Z particularly looks at abortion rights, it is more supporting of abortion rights than any other generation. And so for a lot of the anti-abortion community, they're going to need to actually win over the youngest to be able to change the hearts and mind. That, at least the data that I'm looking at right now, is going to be a very tough move.
Sarah, what's a presidential primary look like on this? Because you've got Donald Trump saying, hey, this didn't help the party. You got Mike Pence, and I've talked to them. I mean, look, as they're trying to sort of establish an identity outside of Trump, this is the identity they want to establish. It's going to, there are going to be a lot of different positions on that stage.
I think that's right, and including, potentially somebody with what was the Lindsey Graham position at one point, which is that we should come up with a national standard and figure out how many weeks.
Or even Chris Sununu, who's going to be even further to the left of that.
And certainly, it's not where I am personally, but politically, that would be a prudent thing for the Republican parties to get to a place where, what number of weeks, because that's where most of the country is. And I think one of the things where the pro-life movement needs to do a stronger job of is exactly to point out where the progressive movement is on this, which is that the progressives believe that you should be able to have an abortion at any point during the pregnancy. And that's not where the country is.
The problem with, I think, this is if you're having a policy debate, you can have a compromise. When many people see this as a morality debate, right? There's no compromise.
Well, the funny thing is, in hindsight, I think Roe, for a lot of the majority of Americans in hindsight, would have been the compromise. Obviously, there's a set of folks who never would have been comfortable with that, but it's clearly where the majority of the American people were. I think the challenge now is anything the Republican Party does is actually taking the fight into the other states where it is legal. So when even if you're saying we're going to do a 15-week national ban, holy cow, suddenly New York and California, that's a state where abortion is legal, and it will no longer be illegal after 15 weeks. So I actually think there's even more ground for the Republican Party to lose if they're honest about it.
But I think some were saying that's the whole point. Go back to the states. And I think some Republicans wanted to keep it there, like let California do what California wants to do. I think he's right a little bit here.
But that's also part of where someone's position might come out, which is like, ultimately, this is a states' rights issue. This is where the party has been and where the movement has been for a long time. And if California has a particularly liberal interpretation of this and Oklahoma has something different, that's been the position of the party for a long time. And I think that's you could also just settle there too.
I actually think that the last few months have revealed that it's much more of it was more of a strategy to argue about the states' rights thing, because
in practice the
minute it got revealed, they're like, no, we're doing national.
Right. All right, I got to let this go. But I'm amazed at how few people actually know so much about 1998 and Monica and the history of that. Go listen to at least the Slow Burn podcast if you don't. Mark, Devin, Sarah, thank you all. After the break, long time gone. New reporting on the trailblazing female lawmakers making history on Capitol Hill by being at the helm of the extremely powerful appropriation committees. The people actually giving the from the government to the people, all women now. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Yeah, women manage the checkbooks at home. Welcome back. It is no secret that Democrats are facing a tough Senate map in 2024. A lot more blue than red on that map of the 34 Senate seats on the board you see there, including the second Nebraska seat because of Ben Sass leaving early. 23 of the 34 are currently held by Democrats, including 3 independents that caucus with the Democrats, Arizona, Maine, and Vermont. Then, remember, Kyrsten Sinema, in case you forgot, changed her party affiliation to independent We'll have more on that state later. But Democrats can breathe one small sigh of relief today after Virginia Senator Tim Kaine held an event in Richmond today and announced that he will indeed seek a third term. There had been some speculation. He's been fighting long COVID, that maybe he was not going to seek another term. On the Republican side earlier this week, Indiana Congressman Jim Banks announced his bid for Senate in what is expected to be a pretty crowded Republican primary because the current Senator Mike Braun's running for governor. The big other candidate in that Indiana race, the former governor, Mitch Daniels. It's going to be a fascinating primary between Daniels and Banks. Also this week, former State Senator Matt Dolan announced his second bid for Ohio, for the Senate seat in Ohio after losing in a Republican primary there last year. He's looking to take on incumbent Democrat Sherrod Brown. He is certainly the Republican Mitch McConnell would prefer, but he was also the Republican Mitch McConnell preferred the last time. And we know how that turned out in the Republican primary. And in Arizona, that Senate race is starting to take shape. Democratic Congressman Greg Stanton now says he will not run for the Senate. It clears the path for fellow Congressman Ruben Gallego, who is expected to formally announce his bid on Monday. Senator Kyrsten Sinema, meanwhile, has yet to announce her 2024 intentions as Democrats grapple with whether to back the incumbent independent should she choose to run. And it potentially opens the door to a three-way race come November that could threaten to split the Democratic vote and pave the way for a Republican victory. Now let's turn now to the business of this Congress. Pretty interesting milestone here. For the first time ever, women will hold the top spots on the powerful appropriations committees. NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Julie Sirkin spoke to the 4 veteran lawmakers who have earned their way up to the top of the seniority ladder that will now shape federal spending on everything from education to defense to health care. Take a listen.
I think it's 1973. There were 2 women who headed up a committee, and the committee was on the House Beauty Salon.
Fast forward 50 years, and for the first time, women will be at the helm of Congress's extremely powerful committees on appropriations. In the Senate, Patty Murray is now the chairwoman, and Susan Collins is the top Republican. In the House, Kay Granger has the gavel, and Rosa DeLauro is the ranking member. They certainly don't agree on everything, but these 4 women have one thing in common. They are trailblazers.
Oh, man, when I came here, there were just a handful. And we had to prove ourselves in every single room that we were just as capable, which is why maybe we're better legislators.
These committee leadership positions, known as the 4 corners to Capitol Hill insiders, have the enormous power of the purse, tasked with the must-pass appropriations bills that keep the federal government funded. And now these veteran lawmakers are in the middle of a bitter fight over government spending in a closely divided Congress.
It's really a difficult time. We can make it through, but I absolutely am convinced we have to stand together.
House Speaker Kevin McCarthy made concessions in exchange for the gavel that would slash discretionary spending, putting child care and paid leave policies at risk.
It's our job to make sure that doesn't happen. It really, because there's a lot of thought that was put in to get to this position and to really help women.
The $1.7 trillion funding package signed into law last month expanded resources for pregnant women and new moms. It's progress all 4 lawmakers are vowing to build upon.
Do you think that men being in power often overlook those issues?
I think men do see those issues because we push them really hard. But we have to remind them constantly that these are front and center and first priorities, not last priorities.
Well, I think every issue is a woman's issue. So whether we're talking about national security or child care, women are affected.
Across Pennsylvania Avenue, new mom Shalonda Young is the first Black woman to lead the Office of Management and Budget.
I came to this town the summer of 2001, and men held every one of those budget jobs, including my own.
Where she'll work hand in hand with the 4 lawmakers, just as she's done for nearly 2 decades as a staffer on Capitol Hill.
The historic nature of it should not be lost. However, those women are tough as nails.
Since the U.S. Congress first convened in 1789, nearly 13,000 people have served as representatives, senators, or both. But out of that number, just 440 women. And more than a third of them still serve today.
I remember when I first came to the Senate, I was 99th in seniority out of the 100 members. Now in the new Congress, I'll be 8th in seniority. And with seniority comes more clout, more influence, more knowledge.
And it also comes with more responsibility.
We address every single issue that comes before the national security of this country, and If you do not have bicameral, bipartisan support, the government shuts down.
Joining me now is our congressional correspondent, Julie Sirkin, who put together this piece. And Julie, you know, it's such a uplifting piece. It makes me think, debt ceiling, schmet ceiling. These 4 women are going to get this done. I mean, I say this in this respect. I know all 4 of them pretty well. They're not grandstanders. Should that tell us that maybe this is our way out of this potential mess in 6 months?
Yeah, look, they hope so. And Chuck, I asked them, I was like, look, Americans mostly don't pay attention to the work these committees do, which is really, really expansive until there's a threat of a government shutdown or a debt ceiling fight like we're experiencing right now. And Patty Murray, the senator that you saw on the screen there, who's going to chair the Appropriations Committee in the Senate, she told me, look, women are good communicators. We might be better than our male counterparts, and we get things done. We message to Americans the right way. We communicate about the issues that matter. And look, she told me, including Kate Granger, who of course is going to be right in the middle of this fight in the House with Kevin McCarthy, that they know how to work together and they foster these relationships, and that's going to make a difference. Well, it's exactly what the intent is. 4 people from 4 different parts of the country that have to come together from different. We'll see. You know, you made me, after a really depressing start to the year, you made me think maybe Congress can act like they used to, or at least what we want them to act like. Anyway, Julie Sirkin, thanks for that reporting. Still to come, defense leaders from more than 50 countries are holding a high-stakes meeting in Germany, but they still have hit an impasse over tanks for Ukraine. We're live in Kyiv with details on the dispute and what it means for the war. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. As the war in Ukraine nears the 1-year mark, the White House has outlined new actions against a Russian mercenary group who has been on the front lines of this war. NSC coordinator John Kirby told reporters today that the Treasury Department is officially designating the Wagner Group as a significant transnational criminal organization, which means they can start to sanction this group, and they're going to announce sanctions against this group next week. White House also released new images today showing North Korea transferring weaponry to the Wagner Group for use in this war. So the Russians have somehow united both North Korea and Iran in helping them in this war. Meanwhile, defense leaders gathered in Germany today to discuss the West's ongoing support to Ukraine, but failed to reach an agreement on the transfer of German-manufactured tanks. As Ukraine continues to request additional weaponry before combat resumes in the spring, General Mark Milley offered his perspective on what to expect this year.
From a military standpoint, I still maintain that for this year, it would be very, very difficult to militarily eject the Russian forces from every inch of Ukrainian-occupied or Russian-occupied Ukraine.
And on the ground in Kyiv today, U.S. Senators Blumenthal, Graham, and White House met with President Zelensky and vowed their continued support. Joining me now is NBC News foreign correspondent Raf Sanchez. He's on the ground in Kyiv. And Raf, let's talk about this tank issue. It seems as if it's not as the Germans will never give these tanks. They just don't want to do it unilaterally. What's going to happen?
They just don't want to do it unilaterally, Chuck. And a U.S. official telling NBC News they want the Americans to agree to give their tanks before Germany agrees to send their own. Now, the issue from the White House perspective is the M1 Abrams tank used by the U.S. is a very, very specialized piece of equipment. It needs a lot of complicated maintenance, and it is an absolute gas guzzler. It can use up to a gallon of gasoline a minute under some circumstances. The military is saying it is just not a practical tank for the Ukrainians to maintain on the battlefield, whereas the German Leopard tank is available in Europe already. The spare parts are there. It's ready to go, and the U.S. would like to see Germany not only sending its own tanks, but giving permission to other NATO allies to send their Leopard tanks. As you said, this summit ending today without a deal, to the deep frustration of Ukrainian officials. We met today with the Secretary of Ukraine's National Security Council, and he showed me, Chuck, a live map on his computer where he is tracking the fighting in the east in the city of Bakhmut, street by street by street. He showed me this is an artillery shell, this is an airstrike, and he jabbed at his screen and he said, this is why we need tanks. And he said, I hope the Germans don't end up with blood on their hands. because of this delay. Now, you mentioned we had those 3 U.S. senators here in Kyiv earlier, and they were unanimous, bipartisan group, they were unanimous. Not only should the Germans send tanks, but the Biden administration should agree to send tanks too. And Chuck, you know Lindsey Graham pretty well. You know that he is a pretty blunt speaker. He said he was tired of this clown show over the tanks, except he didn't say clown. He said a different word, which I can't say on air. So a lot of frustrations in a lot of different quarters right now that there has not been an agreement on this tanks issue, Chuck.
Ralph Sanchez, you have a future in diplomacy. That was well done there in how you shared the words. I think we figured it out. Ralph Sanchez on the ground in Ukraine for us. Ralph, as always, stay safe. And thank you all for being with us this hour. We'll be back Monday with more Beat the Press. Now, if it's Sunday, meet the press in your local NBC News station. We got Joe Manchin and Congresswoman Nancy Mace. As you could say, we will be in the center of American politics on Sunday. NBC News Now coverage continues with Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.